You have been watching the wrong rider. Not because you missed something obvious, not because the coverage failed you, but because the Tour de France is structured in a way that almost guarantees you will spend 3 weeks looking at the man in yellow while the most interesting story in the race plays out somewhere behind him, in a white jersey, worn by someone who has now led the young rider classification at all 3 Grand Tours and who his own teammates describe as a rider who does not realize how hard he can actually ride a bike. So, who is really this guy and why is he so special? Mathias Vacek is 24 years old. He is Czech. He is 188 centimeters tall and rides for Lidl-Trek. And after 5 stages of this Tour de France, he is sitting 3rd on the general classification, 3 minutes and 50 seconds behind yellow jersey Torstein Treen, ahead of Remco Evenepoel, ahead of Isaac del Toro, ahead of Juan Ayuso, ahead of Paul Seixas. The only 2 riders above him in this race are a Norwegian on borrowed time and an American who got into the break on the same day Vacek did and happened to finish slightly closer to the front. So here is the question I want you to actually think about before we go any further. If Mathias Vacek is sitting 3rd at the Tour de France after 5 stages, wearing the white jersey, contributing a lead-out to a stage win for Mads Pedersen, while simultaneously managing his own general classification position, and his teammates are publicly saying he does not know his own limits yet, then why is almost nobody talking about him? I have a theory, and it connects directly to something in cycling culture that is genuinely worth examining, because it shapes how the sport gets covered and how riders get valued, and it has been quietly working against Vacek for his entire career. Let me start where his story actually starts, because it is not where you would expect. Beroun is a small city about 30 kilometers southwest of Prague. Not a cycling hotbed. Not a place with a famous tradition of producing World Tour professionals. Vacek grew up there alongside his older brother Karel, who is also a professional cyclist, which tells you something about the household but does not explain what Mathias became, because the sport he was genuinely serious about as a teenager was not cycling at all. It was cross-country skiing. He was good enough at skiing to represent the Czech Republic at the Youth Olympic Games in 2020. A Winter Youth Olympics athlete who would go on to lead the young rider classification at all 3 Grand Tours. That is not a typical development pathway, and the physical qualities it built into him, the aerobic engine, the capacity to sustain effort over long periods, the mental endurance required by a sport where you are alone in the cold for hours at a time, are exactly the qualities that make him so difficult to shake on a long breakaway day in July. He turned to cycling seriously in 2021, joining Gazprom Rozvelo as a professional at 19. His first World Tour win came in 2022 at the UAE Tour, a stage won from a breakaway. That same year, his team lost its UCI license following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Vacek suddenly found himself without a team mid-season, his career at risk of stalling before it had really started through no fault of his own. Trek Segafredo, now Lidl-Trek, took him as a stagiaire and then signed him for 3 years. That decision looks different today than it did at the time, and I think it is worth understanding why Trek made it. Because at the end of 2022, while still officially teamless and riding as a stagiaire, Vacek finished 2nd at the Under-23 European Road Race Championships and 2nd at the Under-23 World Road Race Championships. Back-to-back silver medals at the 2 biggest races for his age group in the same month. He was 20 years old, his professional team had just collapsed around him, and he still went out and finished 2nd in the world. Trek signed him before that 2nd silver medal was even awarded. What followed was a 4-year process of methodical development that produced the rider you are watching at this Tour de France. And the specific shape of that development is important to understand because it explains why Vacek is so difficult to categorize and why that difficulty has kept him slightly outside the spotlight, even as his results have consistently demanded attention. He is not a pure climber. He is not a pure sprinter. He is not a time trial specialist, though he has won Czech national time trial titles and is faster against the clock than most riders his size. He is what the sport calls an all-rounder, which sounds like a compliment but functions in practice as a kind of professional invisibility. All-rounders do not win the races that generate the most coverage. They do not have the single defining attribute that allows a commentator to reduce them to one word. They tend to work for other people on the biggest days and shine on the days that other people are resting. And because of that, their value often goes unremarked upon by the general audience, even when the people inside the sport know exactly what they are looking at. Vacek's teammates at Lidl-Trek know what they are looking at. After stage 4 of this tour, Cycling News published a feature in which multiple Lidl-Trek riders were asked about Vacek. The specific phrase that appeared, attributed to more than one rider, was that he does not realize how hard he can ride a bike. That is an unusual thing to say about a professional cyclist. Most riders at World Tour level have spent years with power meters and coaches and sports scientists, and they have a very precise understanding of their own output and their own limits. The suggestion that Vacek has not yet found his ceiling is either a polite piece of team PR or it is a genuine observation from people who train alongside him every day and have watched him produce efforts that surprised even himself. Given what happened on stage 4, I lean toward the second interpretation. Here is what Vacek actually did on that stage. His team went into the day with a clear plan centered on getting Pedersen into the decisive break and delivering him to a sprint in Foix. Vacek was one of 3 Lidl-Trek riders who made it into the 34-man group that went clear in the first 25 kilometers. Through the Col de Coudons and then the Col de Montsegur, as the break reduced and the riders fighting for the stage began to show themselves, Vacek kept pace on climbs that should have been above his natural register. He worked for Pedersen. He helped Quinn Simmons. He maintained his own position in the group without panicking and without burning himself out on the climbs the way a flat specialist would have done. And then, somewhere in the final 30 kilometers, he received information through his earpiece that the white jersey was within reach. And his own words afterward tell you everything. He said that when he realized it was possible, it gave him a rush. Not fear. Not anxiety about a target that suddenly appeared. A rush. That is the mentality of a rider who responds to opportunity rather than being paralyzed by it. And that mentality, more than his power numbers or his sprint or his ability on a climb, is what makes him genuinely interesting to watch in the context of this tour. Because here is the thing about the general classification position he now holds. 3rd place after 5 stages at the Tour de France, ahead of every legitimate GC contender except Trian and Quinn, is not where anyone expected Vacek to be. The Lidl-Trek plan for this race was built around Pedersen for stages and Juan Ayuso for the general classification. Ayuso is 9th at 8 minutes and 20 seconds. Vacek is 3rd at 3 minutes and 50 seconds. Those 2 numbers sitting next to each other in the standings tell a story about how this race has unfolded that the usual Tour de France narrative has not fully absorbed yet. Now here is where I want to be direct with you about what actually happens next, because I think the honest version of Vacek's story at this tour requires a different kind of realism than the version you will find in most coverage. The Tourmalet is tomorrow. Stage 6 goes over one of the most mythical and feared climbs in professional cycling before finishing at Gavinigadre in the High Pyrenees. The GC riders who have been sitting 8 minutes behind Trajan are going to stop managing the race and start trying to break it. Pogačar will attack. Vingegaard will respond. And the mountain will do what the mountain always does, which is sort the field by pure climbing ability and leave almost no room for intelligence or positioning or aerobic engine to compensate for raw altitude performance. Vacek is not a mountain climber in the way Pogačar is a mountain climber or Seichas is a mountain climber. He is a rider who can survive climbs that would eliminate most professionals, but the Pyrenees at full race pace with the top GC riders going deep into the red is a different proposition from surviving the Montsegur in a controlled breakaway group on a transitional stage. He will likely lose time tomorrow. The white jersey may come under pressure from Del Toro, who is sitting 4th overall at 8 minutes and 17 seconds and has the climbing profile to move up significantly on a hard summit finish. And here is the part of this story that I think matters more than any individual stage result. Vacek said before this tour that he believed wearing the white jersey at the Tour de France was possible, just barely possible, but that after the first day in Barcelona, he thought it was going to be very difficult. He was right that it would be difficult. He was wrong that it was going to be too difficult. What changed between his pre-race assessment and what actually happened is not his form or his fitness. What changed is that he found himself in exactly the right situation on exactly the right stage, made the right decisions inside that breakaway, and let the opportunity come to him rather than forcing something that was not there. That capacity to recognize a race situation accurately and respond to it rather than trying to impose a predetermined plan on a race that is already doing something different is rarer at this level than power or speed or climbing ability. Most riders at 24 are still learning that lesson. Most riders at 24 at their first Tour de France are simply trying to survive. Vacek is sitting 3rd on the general classification after 5 stages, wearing white, having contributed to a stage win and positioned himself inside the top 3 of the biggest bike race in the world while simultaneously managing his role as a team rider for Pedersen. Tomorrow, the Tourmalet tells us what the next 2 weeks look like for him. But what the first 5 stages have already told us is something that I think the sport has been slow to say clearly. Mathias Vacek is not a promising young rider with potential. He is a current Tour de France top 3 rider who does not yet know what his ceiling is. That sentence is going to mean something very different depending on what happens in the mountains. Don't stop here. The next video on your screen is even more unbelievable. Go watch it now.